What did Roman prostitutes actually do all day? Tonight, we step into a side of ancient Rome. Most polite histories don't linger over the everyday working lives, the forced choices, and the quiet economies of the people who provided sex for pay. We will not sensationalize. We will listen, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like that steady hum, and make yourself comfortable. If you enjoy slow, immersive history like this, consider tapping like and subscribing only if you genuinely want more. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's always a small delight to see this story reach different beds, trains, and late-night desks around the world. You wake to the sound of the street below. In the Suburra or near the Forum, the clatter of carts competes with storekeepers calling wares and a dog barking at the corner. If you are a sex worker in Rome, a meretrix, a leaner's captive, or a freedwoman selling time by the hour, your day begins before the city fully wakes. The rooms where you sleep could be a single chamber above a bakery, a cramped room in a tenement block, or a cell behind the wooden shutter of a small shop. If you are enslaved, the key is not yours. If you are freed, you carry your own hope like a small purse, fragile and sometimes empty. Mornings are practical. Food, if there is any, bread, then porridge, the last of yesterday's stew reheated. You check your clothing, a tunic cleaned as best you can, a sash, maybe a bronze hairpin. Jewelry is worn when safety and show can afford it. Not because it declares wealth, it rarely does, but because it is the currency of appearance. It promises something the city wants to buy. There are small routines that repeat like prayers. Wash your face in cold water drawn from the street cistern. Braid your hair to keep it out of your way. Practice a smile in a cracked mirror. With each tiny ritual, you attempt control over a life largely decided by others. Where did work happen? Roman sex work was not confined to one building or one kind of place. There were doorways in the Suburra where a woman might stand and exchange a few words with a passing client. There were inns and taverns where discreet rooms could be rented by the hour. And there were brothels, small windowless rooms, curtained booths, and signs advertising in blunt, practical ways. Brothels in Rome had a specific name in Latin, lupernaria literally, places of wolves. The word was both crude and candid, and the image was not accidental. Sex in the city was something raw, something public, something regulated and tolerated rather than mourned or celebrated. A lupana could be a row of booths around a courtyard, each with a small bed and a little oil lamp. Its owner, a frank man who managed bookings, kept a coffers, and sometimes acted as guard. In larger cities, these places were known, marked on certain maps, and often located where sailors, soldiers, and travelers would pass. Easy access was the business plan, but there were also higher-tier courtesans, women, and sometimes men who moved in society differently. These were not the doorways of the Suburra. They had clients who might be men of status, occasional senators, or foreign merchants. These courtesans negotiated longer arrangements, received gifts and favors, sometimes lived in rooms with better light and food, and occasionally precarious kind of influence. Clients came from every corner of Roman life. Farmers visiting the city, sailors with pay in their pockets after a long voyage, soldiers with time between campaigns, slaves by a few hours' respite at a tavern, men of higher rank who needed secrecy. Even boys of the household sometimes found their way to places of purchase in cultures and households where male sexual availability was understood differently. Motivations varied. Some sought comfort, some sought novelty, some sought the thrill of anonymity. Some wanted to be seen without consequences. Others wanted to experience something forbidden. To the men who came, the act could be a simple transaction. To the workers, it was survival, strategy, or both. It's important to remember, the client is not a monolith. The single word hides a chorus of needs: the lonely, the curious, the powerful, and the bereft. A denarius is mentioned in many texts as a unit of daily wages. For a laborer, a denarius might be a day's work. Prices in brothels were pragmatic and tiered. A simple encounter might be the cost of a modest coin, while a well-known courtesan who entertained in a house could command a much higher fee. Food, gifts, and favors included. Payment could be in coin, yes, but also in bread, in work, in protection. Some arrangements were longer. A patron might support an expensive partner for a season or a year. Others lasted as long as a lamp burned. The economy of sex in Rome was flexible, adapted to circumstance, and as dependent on reputation as any other trade. Behind every coin counted, there was often a ledger of debts, favors, and sometimes a chain to a lender who provided the tunic, the room, or the rim of a household. Roman society had complicated relationships with public morality. Prostitution was neither truly legal in a modern sense nor fully criminalized. Instead, it was regulated and tolerated. The state taxed the trade in many cities. Prostitutes were often marked by a legal status called infamia, a kind of civic disfavor that carried real penalties. Restrictions on testifying in court, on holding certain public roles, and on social standing. Infamia shaped lives. It meant that even if a woman was free, her legal options and social protections were limited. A freed woman who worked as a prostitute might remain socially and legally vulnerable in ways a freeborn Roman citizen was not. Remember the difference between moral judgment and structural reality. The judgments written and spoken were loud, but the structures that enforced those judgments were often woven into economic necessity. Who owned you? Who cared for you? Who could protect you? Let us map a typical working day. You perform small tasks in a particular order because routine is how you survive. Morning, tend to the body, wash, arrange clothes, prepare the room. Midday, the first clients. Trade the morning's dullness for coin. Afternoon, lull, cleaning. Mending, times where one can trade favors in culture, barter with food, or fetch supplies. Evening, the busiest hours. More clients, more complex arrangements. Possibly a night hire where staying the night brings better payment. Night, winding down, counting the day's money, settling any disputes with the owner or manager, patching linens and preparing for tomorrow. Work is punctuated by small comforts. A bowl of warm porridge, a favored token gifted by a returning client, or a short conversation with another worker about where to find a better tunic. But there are also interruptions. The threat of violence, the pressure of debt collectors, the nausea of illnesses, and the ever-present legal vulnerability. For many, the day's end is not rest but a breath held until the next call. Health was precarious. Without modern medicine, infections could fester. Sexually transmitted infections existed, and remedies were rudimentary at best. Herbal compresses, oils, and sometimes more dangerous concoctions. Contraception was attempted through folk methods, pessaries concocted from substances meant to act as barriers, or spermicides, with varying and uncertain success. Workers developed their own safety protocols, screening clients where possible, negotiating terms, refusing certain acts, or insisting on payment upfront. Some worked together in small collectives to create a form of safety in numbers. When possible, forming relationships with patrons who provided protection was pragmatic. Violence was never far. Lenone's procurers who managed clients and bookings could be protective or exploitative. The difference often depended on the balance of power in a particular household, the owner's temper, the size of the city guard's pocket, the client's status. Not all sex work in Rome was the same. Courtesans and companions who cultivated long-term, higher-paying patrons moved among social salons and private dinner parties. They exchanged stories, literacy, wit, and sometimes influence. A skilled courtesan might be reading poetry and remembered for her company in both intimate and literary circles. These arrangements could bring access to books, better food, a small apartment, and occasional political gossip. They could also trap the worker in a relationship of economic dependency. A patron could be a lifeline or a leash, yet within this precarious social space, some courtesans amassed real cultural capital. Their names spread in certain circles. They were often the subjects of poems, the keepers of letters, and the quiet actors in private politics. These lives were neither wholly free nor merely enslaved. They were complex alliances negotiated across cups of wine and dim lamps. Many sex workers were also mothers, sisters, and daughters. Their work fed households. Children could be raised in cramped rooms, in the care of relatives, or in the shadows of the market where mothers bartered time for food. For enslaved sex workers, the situation was grimmer. Their children might be the property of the owner. Community could be both supportive and punitive. Women working near one another created networks, sharing food, warning about dangerous clients, trading tips for mending garments. Yet the larger society often stigmatized them. Children might be denied certain civic rights. A mother's work could shape her child's prospects. Still, networks endured. Priests who provided small charity, neighbors who offered bread, friends who offered a bed for the night. It is also true that some people of status visited brothels by custom, while public moralizing targeted women more than men. This double standard is part of the Roman social fabric. How society's police bodies tells us more about power than about personal vice. So what do we learn? The daily life of a Roman sex worker mixes routine, improvisation, courage, and vulnerability. That survival often required striking bargains with clients, with owners, with silence. That the people we now name prostitutes were mothers, cooks, debtors, poets, and witnesses to a city that never quite slept. If tonight's episode lingered with you, and you'd like more slow, careful histories told in this voice places, people, and everyday lives, consider subscribing and joining the playlist titled Daily Lives of History on the channel. If you have a title idea or a name from Roman history you want me to explore next, leave it below. I read your comments. A small request. If one detail surprised you, the economics, the safety practices, or the complicated social life, tap the like button. It helps the channel reach other late-night listeners like you. And if you'd like the transcript or chapter timestamps for tonight's episode, tell me in the comments and I'll pin them there. Thank you for listening quietly with me. Dim the lights a little more, breathe, and if you're here to sleep, let the city of Rome fade in the background like a slow, distant tide. Good night. We return to the quiet, the lamp's flame, the scrape of a bowl, the breath between one client and the next. We've walked a long way through a single day. Now, let us widen the lens to law and ledger, to literature and inscription, to the tiny private economies that made life possible, and the public rules that tried imperfectly to contain it. Stay with me. Breathe slowly. This next hour is less a parade of events than a patient listening to the many small voices the past left behind. The Roman world recorded itself unevenly. Statutes, inscriptions, satirists, and court records give us different angles, some legal, some mocking, some painfully direct. From these fragments we can piece together how cities tried to regulate bodies and commerce. The city treasuries wanted taxes, magistrates wanted public order, moralists wanted virtue. In between those aims lived the actual people, workers who negotiated hours, owners who counted coins, clients who preferred discretion. Law rarely captures the texture of a bowl of porridge or the intimacy of a whispered bargain, yet it shapes the possibilities within which those scenes played out. One persistent legal mark on sex workers was infamia. The term sounds colder than the lives it affected. Infamy in Roman law was a civic scar, a status that limited the rights and reputations of those marked by it. The import of this designation was practical as much as symbolic. A person branded infamous could be barred from giving certain legal testimonies, excluded from some offices, and stigmatized in social transactions. The law tended to treat sex work as a public inconvenience, an activity tolerated, because it would otherwise be pushed into darker corners. Taxation, when imposed, treated sex as commerce. Infamia treated those who provided it as morally suspect. The two together, profit and punishment, reveal the paradox Rome lived. A pragmatic city that simultaneously moralized and monetized. What did that paradox mean in daily life? If you were a worker trying to feed a child, infamia could be the difference between securing a guarantor's help and being turned away from legal protections. If you were a freedwoman who attempted to assert a contract in court, a judge might doubt your testimony simply because the law cast a structural shadow over your credibility. And yet the presence of infamia didn't erase private relationships. Patrons could make gifts that skirted legal status. Local priests and neighbors sometimes offered small kindnesses. The law shaped risk and possibility, but it did not fully determine human sympathy or human calculation. Sources beyond the law complicate the picture further. Poets, satirists, and playwrights often painted sex workers in broad strokes: comic, cynical, cautionary. Juvenal and Martial, for instance, used the image of the meretrix as a rhetorical tool, to shock, to punish moral failing, or to tease a patron. Their verses are sometimes cruel, sometimes affectionate, and rarely neutral. But we must read such literature as literature, stylized, performative, and aimed at an audience that enjoyed the joke. Embedded in those jokes, however, are kernels of truth, names flown like pebbles, hints of patronage, references to certain neighborhoods. Poetry does not replace archival record, but it offers texture, the timbre of social imagination. Archaeology, when it speaks with different clarity. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, particular rooms, frescoes, and inscriptions suggest spaces used for sex work and advertise services openly. There, Erotic imagery decorated walls not as titillation alone, but as commercial signs. A carved phallus might be less a private object than a shopfront billboard. The brothel facades and small cubicles we can still see are practical. Beds, a basin, a window for light, the neat economy of a room designed for quick use and frequent turnover. These physical remains confirm that sexuality in some urban pockets was visible and organized, not merely whispered rumor. Even so, the brothel was not the whole story. Street work, tavern arrangements, and private patronage all blurred the lines. One reason street-based work was common is the urban geography. Markets, docks, and inns created natural congregation points for people in transit. The very traffic that fed trade also fed an informal labor market. The worker who chose or was coerced into street engagement traded privacy for accessibility. The one who negotiated with an innkeeper traded discretion for a roof and maybe a share of the room's rent. Each choice carried cost and benefit. Another set of choices concerned health. Illness in antiquity often arrived uninvited and lingered long after the lamp went out. Sexually transmitted infections were not unknown. Remedies were a mixture of folk practice and learned medicine. Cleansing baths, vinegar rinses, poultices, of herbs and pills of substances we would now find dubious. Physicians of the time prescribed diets, bandages, and the evacuation of bad humors. Midwives and local healers offered simpler, more immediate treatments. Access to a physician depended on means. A courtesan with a wealthy patron might have a doctor in call. Most workers relied on shared remedies or the kindness of a neighbor. The absence of reliable contraception also shaped lives. Pregnancy could mean another mouth to feed, another dependency, or in some cases, the sale of a child. Some women gave children to relatives to raise. Others found wet nurses. Some sold or relinquished infants in the throes of survival. These choices were brutal and heartbreaking, but they were also pragmatic adaptations to a world without safety nets. There were rituals and routines that offered small protections. Workers formed mutual aid networks, informal guilds of the desperate and the resolute. In those networks, a woman might lend a tunic, share a corner of bread, swap the location of a quieter inn, or parcel on the name of a man to be avoided. In neighborhoods where work was clustered, these COPs sometimes developed a kind of local governance, a tacit arrangement about who worked which corner at what hour, a rule against certain violent clients, a pooling of funds for the burial of a fellow worker. This is not romanticization. It is recognition that survival often depends on community, even among the most stigmatized professions. Consider also the private economies that intersected with sex work: laundries, seamstresses, tavern keepers, and small-scale traders. A worker might be owed cloth by a seamstress, sleep on a tavern floor for a small fee, or accept bread from the baker in exchange for feathers. The flows of goods and credit underwrote the visible market of sex. Money came in, but so did feathers. Promises and obligations. Debts were fluid. Open accounts could be kept in the margins of a ledger. The household that owned the room, the Lino's house, might be an economic node, extending credit and extracting a share. Owners invested. In beds, stains on the rugs, a small lamp that never quite dimmed. In that system, the owner had capital and some security. The workers had labor and vulnerability. Sometimes a worker's skill created a small path to stability. The courtesan who could read, for instance, the one who could entertain a literate guest and discuss poetry or politics, might cultivate a patron who rewarded education with access to books, with a small apartment, or with a social place of a different order. Literacy opened doors. It also could be a trap. The patron who supplied books might also expect exclusive time, gifts, and emotional loyalty. The line between patronage and possession was thin. Children who grew up in those households carried stories of survival that shaped their later lives. Some children of workers married into modest trades. Others were apprenticed. Others fell into cycles of dependence. Family structures were resilient and often surprising. We find inscriptions of women who outlived owners, who saved a little to buy a small house, who left a modest tombstone of remembrance. Tombstones are a quiet archive of dignity. The name, an expression of affection, an image of a lamp or bowl. They tell us that people loved and were remembered, that their losses matter to someone in that community. Religion and ritual also intersected with daily economies. Temples were both spiritual centers and practical ones. Pilgrims brought food and coin. Priests sometimes offered alms. Certain festivals permitted behaviors otherwise frowned upon in everyday life. Ritual intoxication and sanctioned sexual rites in particular cults complicated simple moral frameworks. The overlap of the sacred and the profane was not always clear-cut. Priests might denounce lax morals in one sermon and accept temple dues from the very people they criticized. Yet there were also temples that offered refuge, charitable spaces where one could be fed or find a roof for a night. The intersection of piety and pragmatism created avenues of aid. Regional variation matters too. Urban Rome, with its cosmopolitan flows and dense population, offered a different world from provincial towns. In port cities, the arrival and departure of ships regulated demand. In festival towns, seasonal crowds swelled the market for companionship. Rural areas offered other constraints, fewer clients, more visibility, and different kinds of reputational cost. Migration shaped the labor pool. Women and men moved to cities in search of work, often ending up in spaces that city economies made available. Those migratory flows reshaped neighborhoods. Trades clustered, languages mingled, and new networks emerged. Over time, patterns changed. The ancient world evolved through centuries. Legal frameworks were reworked, imperial edicts adjusted taxes and policing priorities, and emergent religions altered public morals. The rise of Christianity, for instance, introduced new discourses on sin, repentance, and redemption. Church institutions set up charitable houses and offered moral re-education in ways that could both help and constrain workers. The church's stance complicated existing structures. Sudden moral fervor could increase penalties or push work underground. Conversely, charitable distribution could offer temporary relief to someone in need. Equally important is the way narratives changed across generations. What poets once treated as a comic trope might later be reframed in moralizing sermons. What an epigraph recorded as a name might be read centuries later as a scandal. These narrative shifts remind us that histories are not only about lived facts, but about the stories that communities tell about those facts. Who writes the story matters as much as the story itself. Let us bring the focus back to the human center, the interior life of the worker. Beyond routine and risk, lives contained aspirations, small pleasures, and stubborn humor. A woman might keep a cherished comb, a small carved amulet, a ribbon given by a client who promised to return but never did. Some kept a private corner for prayer. Others found ritual in the act of washing a tunic until it shone. Love was not absent. There were marriages, slow-burning affections, and pragmatic liaisons that provided emotional shelter. A patron could be lover and jailer. Friends could be respite and risk. As people aged, options narrowed. The worker who once could attract a patron and command a higher fee might find age diminishing demand. Without pensions or social welfare, survival strategies shifted. Some moved towards simpler services with lower physical demand. Some took up other trades, sewing, weaving, cleaning if they were skilled. Others relied on relatives to share a hearth. The presence of a supportive kin network could be a lifesaver. Where kin failed or kin had no means, the community sometimes stood in neighbors pooling funds for a burial or a last meal. Death in these neighborhoods was often a quiet, communal affair. A small procession, a stone marker, a name remembered. In fragments, we should also ask how the broader economy shaped choices. In boom times, with grain plentiful and trade thriving, discretionary spending increased, and so did the private economy of leisure. In lean times, famine, war, epidemic, the delicate calculus of survival changed. Demand might fall. Patrons left town. Incomes shrank. In such conditions, price negotiation became sharper and risks grew. The workers' adaptability, shifting hours, changing location, taking in laundry determined who survived episodic crises. Then there is the question of mobility, both social and geographic. Some workers managed to save enough to set up small shops, marry, or invest in a modest trade. Others used their connections with patrons to secure marriage into a slightly more stable household. Mobility was not guaranteed, but it existed. Stories of such mobility are precious precisely because they are uncommon. An inscription here and a tombstone there that tells of a woman who made a bequest to a temple, perhaps paying for a lamp that would burn in memory of a life that had been precarious and in some ways full. We cannot close this exploration without reflection on our own vantage point. Looking back across the millennia, it is tempting to project modern moral frameworks onto past lives. Yet for people then, categories and constraints had different contours. Property, honor, debt, and community define choices in ways that require careful listening. We must attend to the small archives, a lawyer's record, a poet's joke, a charred ash layer in a brothel, a child's toy found in a corner under a floor. Each fragment is an echo. Taken together, they create a fuller picture. People who are bored. In the intimate economy, not as caricatures but as actors in complex social, economic, and emotional worlds. So what might we carry forward from this listening? For one thing, humility in judgment. The past teaches us that survival shapes moral compromise, that legal definitions can both shelter and wound, that community often provides what public structures refuse. For another, curiosity about continuity. The interplay of service economies, stigma, and agency is not confined to antiquity. Modern debates over labor, autonomy, and social protection echo ancient questions. That connection does not erase difference, but it invites empathy. Before we close, imagine again that room in the superior at dawn. The woman we met earlier. Braided hair, one tunic, the small lamp on the table. She counts a small handful of coins. She tucks a ribbon into a seam she will mend later. She hears the clatter of a cart and thinks of a child, or of a sister, or a hope to save a little for a better winter. She rests her hand on the wood of the table and breathes, calculating, always calculating. This is not a melodramatic image. It is an everyday portrait of tenacity. If you found tonight's listening meaningful, and you want more careful, unhurried histories that attend to the daily lives of people in the past, consider subscribing and joining the playlist Daily Lives of History. If you have a name, a place, or a profession you want me to explore next, please leave it below. I read your comments and I take them into the next night's work. There are many more corners of this topic we could visit, the specific case studies of named courtesans, a deep dive into funerary inscriptions, a comparative study of brothels in Pompeii vs. Ostia, or an exploration of the linguistic shifts in words like maritrix and lupa. If any of those sound useful to you, tell me which and I will prepare deeper episodes, each with sources and gentle narration for the late hours. For now, dim the lamp if you haven't already. Let the city's distant noises fall like a tide. Rest, if you will. Remember that history is not only the great battle or the lawmaker's edict, but the small, stubborn business of human survival. The washing of a tunic, the counting of coins, the quiet bargain made in the hush between two breaths. Good night.